July 1518. Amidst the sweltering summer heat on a cobblestone street in Strasbourg, a woman named Frau Trophäa stepped out of her home. She was not going to the market nor to the church. Instead, she began to dance. There was no music, no smile, only a convulsive, frantic movement, an uncontrollable rhythm that seemed to spring from terror itself. A fever of the feet. At first, people just watched, confused and concerned. But then, the inexplicable happened. Like an invisible sickness spreading on the air, a neighbor joined her. Then another. Within a week, more than 30 people were caught in this frantic spiral. Within a month, 400 citizens of Strasbourg were dancing in the streets. This was not a festival. It was a nightmare. They danced through exhaustion, their feet bloodied, their faces contorted in pain. They could not stop. They danced until they collapsed from strokes, from heart attacks, until their bodies broke under the weight of their own ceaseless motion. And a single question echoed through the narrow alleys, striking terror into the hearts of the people. Why? What is this madness? What could possess the bodies and souls of hundreds, compelling them to dance beyond human endurance until their very hearts gave out? They were not victims of a killer, but of a macabre dance, a nameless curse that had turned their city into a ballroom from hell. To understand how a woman dancing in the street could trigger a citywide apocalypse of the feet, you first have to understand the city itself. You have to peel back the storybook image of half-timbered houses and quaint cobblestones and look at the world that created this madness. Because Strasbourg in the year 1518 was not a fairy tale. It was a powder keg of misery, just waiting for a spark. Let's be clear, the early 16th century was, to put it mildly, having a very bad century. This was the twilight of the Middle Ages, a grim, anxious era where life was cheap and death was a booming industry. The four horsemen of the apocalypse weren't a distant biblical threat. They were the local landlords, and they were overdue on their rent collection. To live in Strasbourg at this time was to exist in a pressure cooker of fear, a relentless cocktail of anxieties that would make our modern-day stresses look like a spa vacation. First, there was the simple, brutal reality of hunger. The years leading up to 1518 had been a string of catastrophic failures. A series of bitter winters, late frosts, and wet springs had decimated the harvests. The price of grain, the very foundation of life, skyrocketed. Imagine if the cost of your daily bread suddenly became more than your weekly wage. Now, imagine that's not an analogy. For the people of Strasbourg, this was their reality. They were starving, not in a poetic, distant way, but in a visceral, stomach-gnawing, watch your children waste away kind of way. Famine stalked the city, a gaunt specter, turning neighbor against neighbor, stripping away the thin veneer of civility with every missed meal. On top of this, hunger came the shadow of disease. The Great Black Death of the 14th century was still a living memory, a cultural scar carved into the soul of Europe. But even without a full-blown plague, life was a medical minefield. Leprosy, smallpox, dysentery, and a mysterious sweating sickness were common. Infant mortality was staggeringly high. To have a child live to adulthood was a victory, not an expectation. Death was not a sanitized, behind-closed-doors event. It was public, frequent, and personal. It was a constant, unwelcome guest at every family's table. So, you have a population that is starving, sick, and grieving. But we must add the most potent ingredient to this toxic stew, a worldview steeped in profound, unshakable superstition. You have to understand, these people did not have science. They had God and the devil's saints, and demons, curses, and miracles. There was no germ theory to explain why a child fell ill. There was only the wrath of God for a hidden sin. There was no meteorology to explain a hailstorm that destroyed the crops. There was only a witch's curse from a neighboring village. The world was not a set of predictable physical laws. It was a constant, terrifying battle between divine forces and demonic trickery. Their understanding of cause and effect was less like a science textbook and more like a poorly written fantasy novel where every plot twist is, a wizard did it. Except the wizard was either an all-powerful, frequently disappointed god, or a devil who saw humanity as his personal playground. This created a state of perpetual, low-grade paranoia. Every misfortune was a sign. Every coincidence was a portent. The world was enchanted, but it was the dark, terrifying enchantment of the deep woods, not the whimsical magic of a fairy tale castle. This was the air they breathed, a thick smog of fear and faith. This then was the world that Frau Trophäa and her neighbors inhabited. A world of empty stomachs, fresh graves, and a sky full of angry gods. It was a world of profound and unrelenting stress, and it is in this world that we find the key players of our tragedy. First, there is our patient zero, Frau Trophäa herself. History records her name, but little else. She was not a noblewoman or a merchant's wife. She was likely an ordinary woman, which is to say, her life was likely extraordinarily difficult. We don't know her specific story, what private grief or desperation finally pushed her over the edge. Had she just buried a child? Was her family on the brink of starvation? Was she crushed by a private guilt she believed had brought ruin upon her household? We'll never know. She was simply the first stone to be dislodged in an avalanche, the first crack to appear in a dam of collective despair that was already groaning under the pressure. Then there are the dancers themselves. It's a mistake to think of them as a mindless mob. They were individuals. They were the blacksmith, whose forge was cold for lack of customers, the weaver, whose loom was silent, the farmer who had come to the city after his lands failed. They were mothers and fathers, sons and daughters, each carrying their own invisible burden of grief and fear. When they saw Frau Trophäa dancing, they didn't see a madwoman. It's possible they saw a reflection of the frantic, desperate energy churning inside their own souls, a feeling so overwhelming it could no longer be contained in the body and had to burst forth in a spasm of uncontrollable movement. They were a chorus of silent screams, finally given a single, terrifying expression. And finally, we have the authorities, the city councilmen, the guild leaders, and the physicians of Strasbourg. These were serious men of status and learning. They were the establishment. And when confronted with a city of people dancing themselves to death, they did what all well-meaning committees do. When faced with a problem that isn't in any of their books, they consulted, they deliberated, and they came to a conclusion that was logical, authoritative, and catastrophically wrong. After examining the dancers, the city's physicians, with all the confidence that 16th century medical science could muster, declared the problem was not supernatural. It was, they announced, a natural disease caused by hot blood in the brain. It was a fever, a physical malady, and the prescribed cure for this malady. Well, it was simple. The dancers had a feverish need to dance, so the only way to cure them was to let them dance it out. They had to keep dancing day and night until the fever broke. It was a diagnosis born of a world that understood the body, but not the mind, a conclusion that was about to turn a bizarre local crisis into a full-blown, lethal catastrophe. The stage was set quite literally for the next act of the tragedy, and the authorities in their infinite wisdom were about to hire the musicians. The city of Strasbourg had a diagnosis. The strange, convulsive malady sweeping through its citizens was a case of hot blood, a natural, if unfortunate, affliction of the body. And with this diagnosis came a cure, one prescribed with all the certainty and authority the city's learned men could muster. It was a cure of such breathtaking stupidity that it bordered on a form of madness all its own. The plan was not to restrain the dancers to comfort them or to seek a deeper cause. The plan was to help them dance, to facilitate their affliction, to lean into the skid right off a cliff, with the kind of brisk, bureaucratic efficiency usually reserved for collecting taxes or organizing a public execution. The city council set to work. Their first order of business was to create a suitable venue for this prescribed therapy. The cramped, winding alleys were deemed insufficient for a proper city-sanctioned outbreak of mass hysteria. So they cleared out the grain market, a large open square that would soon become a theater of the absurd. When that wasn't enough, they commandeered the spacious guild halls, turning centers of commerce into sanatoriums of ceaseless, agonizing movement. But they didn't stop there. In a move that secured their place in the annals of terrible public health policy, the magistrates decided the dancers needed encouragement. They needed a proper atmosphere. So they erected a large wooden stage in the center of the market square, a morbid platform upon which the city's afflicted could publicly perform their slow-motion suicides. And to complete the scene, they did the unthinkable. They hired professional musicians. Try to picture the sheer surreal horror of it. Pipers, fiddlers, and drummers were brought in, paid by the city, to play upbeat, lively tunes. Their energetic melodies filled the air, a grotesque counterpoint to the scene unfolding before them. Men and women, their faces pale with exhaustion and streaked with tears, their limbs jerking in movements they could not control, were now forced to flail and twist to the rhythm of a jaunty drumbeat. It was like hiring a live band to play at an exorcism. It was a solution so profoundly perfectly wrong that it felt like a prank played by a cruel and inventive god. If a man is on fire, do you try to extinguish the flames? No, you hire a fire eater to show him how it's done. Predictably, this state-sponsored rave had the opposite of its intended effect. The sight of a dedicated stage, the sound of professional music, the official sanctioning of the dance. It didn't cure anyone. It validated the hysteria. It drew more people in. The energy of the crowd, amplified by the relentless music, created a powerful feedback loop. People on the verge of mental collapse, seeing their neighbors and friends caught in the grip of this strange compulsion, were pulled over the edge themselves. The cure was not a cure at all. It was gasoline poured on an open flame. The first few days of this organized madness must have been a spectacle of grim chaos. But as the days bled into weeks, the tone shifted from bizarre to tragic. The human body is not designed for this kind of punishment. The relentless motion began to take its horrifying toll. Dancers' shoes worn through gave way to bare feet that were shredded and bloodied on the rough cobblestones. The constant violent jerking led to cracked ribs and dislocated joints. They danced through dehydration, their bodies slick with a sweat that was no longer feverish but cold and clammy with shock. Witness accounts from the time describe a scene from a nightmare. The dancers were not joyful. Their faces were masks of anguish, their eyes wide with a terror that seemed to say they were prisoners in their own bodies. They would weep, they would cry out for mercy, they would beg for it to stop, all while their legs continued to pump and their arms continued to flail, completely disconnected from their conscious will. And then the dying began in earnest. The initial trickle of deaths became a flood. Reports from the time claim that at the plague's peak, as many as 15 people were dying each day. They would simply collapse in the middle of the square, their hearts finally giving out their brains, hemorrhaging from the strain. The jaunty music would falter for a moment as another body was dragged from the stage, another soul extinguished by this bizarre affliction. The well-ordered plan of the city magistrates had descended into a macabre carnival. The dance floor was no longer a place of prescribed therapy. It was a public deathbed. One imagines that, at some point, even the most stubborn of the city fathers began to suspect that their hot blood theory might have a few holes in it. Watching a significant portion of your population literally dance itself to death tends to cast doubt on your initial diagnosis. The cure was not working. The cure was in fact an accelerant, a highly effective method for turning a psychological crisis into a pile of corpses. The music eventually faded. The stage was abandoned. The first disastrous phase of the city's response was over. Panic and desperation now fully gripped the city's leadership. Plan A had failed in the most spectacular way possible. It was time for Plan B. And when medicine fails in a world run by faith and fear, you pivot hard to the supernatural. The city's thinkers, having exhausted their medical knowledge, now turned to their theological playbook. This was not a natural disease of the body after all. This was a spiritual affliction. This was the wrath of God, or perhaps more specifically, the curse of a particular saint. Their panicked search for an explanation landed on Saint Vitus, a Christian martyr from the 4th century, who through a series of historical quirks had become the patron saint to be invoked against epilepsy and neurological disorders, conditions often characterized by uncontrolled movements. The diagnosis was officially changed. This was not hot blood. This was the Curse of Saint Vitus. The dancing plague now had a name, and with a new name came a new, equally desperate cure. The strategy shifted from the medical to the mystical. Having failed with the science of their day, they would now try to fight it with magic. The city that had just hosted a deadly month-long rave was now about to stage a forced religious pilgrimage. The remaining dancers, those who had somehow survived the ordeal, were rounded up. They were weak, emaciated, and still twitching, their bodies and minds shattered. They were loaded onto wagons, not to be taken to a place of rest or care, but to be hauled miles away, up a mountain to a remote shrine dedicated to the very saint they were now believed to have offended. The scene at the shrine was as surreal as the one in the market square had been. The afflicted were forced to participate in a series of bizarre rituals designed to appease the angry saint. They were made to circle a wooden carving of Saint Vitus. Priests placed small crosses in their hands and put specially blessed red shoes on their battered, bloody feet. They anointed them with holy oil and led them in mass. It was a last, desperate gamble, an attempt to exorcise a demon that had taken root in the soul of the city. And then slowly, miraculously, it seemed to work. Whether it was the power of the rituals, the shock of the journey, the change of scenery, or simply the fact that the psychological storm had finally reached its peak and had nowhere to go, but down the last of the dancers began to stop. The frantic energy that had possessed the city for over a month finally dissipated like a fever breaking in the dead of night. The survivors were brought back to a city that was quiet for the first time in weeks. The streets were empty. The stage was gone. All that remained was the silence, the exhaustion, and the ghosts of the hundreds who had not survived. The dancing had stopped, but the question remained, now hanging heavier than ever in the traumatized air of Strasbourg. The official explanation had shifted from flawed medicine to a dubious miracle, but the truth, as it so often is, was something far more complex and far more terrifyingly human. The investigation into the real cause had only just begun. The dancing had stopped. The silence that fell over Strasbourg was heavier and more haunting than the screams and the manic music that had preceded it. The dead were buried. The survivors were left to grapple with the phantom pains and terrifying memories of their ordeal. But for us, the work is just beginning. The crisis may be over, but the case is far from closed. So let's step out of the dusty streets of the 16th century and into the sterile, quiet light of the chamber. This is not a room of stone or wood, but a chamber of analysis where we trade narrative for investigation and story for evidence. It is time to perform a historical autopsy on the madness that seized a city, to sift through the bones of history and diagnose a disease that has baffled chroniclers for 500 years. The case file on the dancing plague of 1518 is now officially open. Our first task in any cold case is to examine the initial conclusions, the theories proposed by the original investigators on the scene. As we've seen, the authorities in Strasbourg had two, which they switched between with the panic of a man trying to guess a password. The first was the medical theory, hot blood. The city's physicians, with the unshakable confidence of men who still believed the alignment of the planets had a direct effect on your digestive health, declared the dancing a natural fever of the brain. This theory has two distinct disadvantages. First, it is in scientific terms complete and utter nonsense, a medical explanation that explains absolutely nothing. Second, their prescribed cure, more dancing, was a public health disaster of such epic proportions that it would be comical if it hadn't been so lethal. It's hard to give much credence to a medical theory whose application resulted in a significant portion of the patient population dying. We can, I think, safely dismiss the hot blood theory as a quaint but deadly piece of medieval malpractice. Their second theory, adopted after the first one, resulted in streets littered with corpses, was supernatural, the Curse of Saint Vitus. Having failed to cure the body, they turned their attention to the soul. This explanation, at least, has a certain internal logic for the time. In a world where God's wrath and saints' displeasure were considered legitimate causes for everything from a toothache to a thunderstorm, blaming a celestial being for a dancing epidemic made a certain kind of sense. The problem, of course, is that it requires us to believe that a long-dead Christian martyr had the power and the inclination to inflict a deadly dance party on a city in the Holy Roman Empire. As a historical or scientific explanation, it's a non-starter. It's a ghost story, and we are not in the business of chasing ghosts. With the 16th century explanations filed away under interesting but useless, we can now open the modern case file and examine the evidence through a new lens. Exhibit of the poison theory. For many years, the leading scientific theory was a compelling and rather cinematic one: mass poisoning. The culprit, it was suggested, was a fungus called ergot, which grows on damp rye. When this infected rye is ground into flour and baked into bread, it can have devastating effects on anyone who eats it. The resulting condition, ergotism, was known in the Middle Ages as St. Anthony's fire. This theory is initially very attractive. Ergot is a natural psychedelic, the raw source from which LSD was first synthesized. Its effects include violent muscle spasms, severe convulsions, delusions, and terrifying hallucinations. On the surface, it sounds like a perfect match: a whole city accidentally dosed with a powerful hallucinogen, driven into a frenzy of crazed movement. It's a fantastic story. The only problem is the symptoms don't quite fit the crime. While ergotism does cause spasms, they are typically chaotic, seizure-like convulsions. They are not the sort of coordinated, rhythmic, and sustained activity that could be described as dancing for days on end. More importantly, the other major symptom of ergotism is gangrene. The fungus severely restricts blood flow to the extremities. Victims' fingers, toes, hands, and feet would turn black, become numb, and eventually fall off. The idea that hundreds of people could dance for weeks while their limbs were literally dying and rotting away defies all medical logic. It is nearly impossible to perform a non-stop jig when you can no longer feel your feet. Given the lack of any historical accounts mentioning gangrene or the other telltale signs, we must reluctantly acquit the bread. Ergotism was a real and terrifying affliction, but it was not the affliction that plagued Strasbourg. Exhibit B. The cult theory. Another theory popular among those who enjoy a good conspiracy suggests that the dancers were not victims at all, but willing participants. This theory posits that they were members of a secret heretical religious cult, performing a ritual dance to achieve a state of religious ecstasy, perhaps in defiance of the mainstream church. This, like the poison theory, makes for a great story. It has intrigue, secrecy, and rebellion. Unfortunately, it suffers from a complete and total lack of evidence. Not a single historical source, not from the city council, the church, or the chroniclers, suggests this was an organized, voluntary event. Every single account emphasizes the suffering of the dancers. They were described as being in agony, begging for help, tormented by their own bodies. This was not the blissful trance of a religious ecstatic. It was the tortured ordeal of a victim. This was not a party. It was a public torment. we can safely file this theory away in the drawer marked speculative fiction. This brings us to our final exhibit, the one that lacks the drama of poison or the intrigue of a secret cult, but has the overwhelming advantage of actually making sense. Exhibit C, the psychological breakdown. The most widely accepted explanation among modern historians and psychologists is that the dancing plague of 1518 was a staggering textbook example of mass psychogenic illness, more commonly, if less precisely, known as mass hysteria. This is a phenomenon where extreme, prolonged psychological stress within a community manifests as shared, real physical symptoms, for which there is no organic cause. This is not to say the dancers were faking it. Their pain was real. Their exhaustion was real. Their deaths were certainly real. But the trigger, the virus that infected them, wasn't a microbe or a toxin. It was an idea. It was fear. To understand this, we must return to the world we established in Part 2. Let's review the stressors, the ingredients that created this psychological powder keg. First, famine and poverty. Not just a bad year, but a series of them. This created a state of chronic life-or-death anxiety that grinds down the human spirit. Second, disease and death. A constant backdrop of sickness and loss, creating a society perpetually steeped in grief and a palpable fear of sudden arbitrary death. And third, the crucial catalyst, a superstitious worldview. The people of Strasbourg lived in a culture that genuinely believed in divine curses and demonic possession. They were psychologically primed to accept a supernatural explanation for their suffering. Their minds were already fertile ground for a belief in an external force that could hijack the body. In this environment, an individual can enter what psychologists call a dissociative state. Under unbearable stress, the mind can essentially disconnect from the body as a coping mechanism. The dance then becomes a physical outlet for a mental anguish that has no other means of expression. It's a desperate unconscious attempt to exorcise the trauma. And here's how it spreads: social contagion. When one person like Frau Troffea publicly enters this trance-like state, it acts as a trigger for others who are under similar immense stress. Seeing it happen to someone else gives their own minds a terrifying kind of permission to break in the same way. It provides a prepackaged script for a mental breakdown. It becomes an accepted, if horrifying, response to the shared, unbearable reality. It's the ultimate peer pressure, but instead of trying a new fashion, you're trying a complete, citywide, psychotic break. This also explains the Saint Vitus connection in a new light. The belief in the curse was the engine of the plague. Because they already had a cultural framework for a dancing curse associated with Saint Vitus, the idea was readily available. When the authorities officially named it the Curse of Saint Vitus, they inadvertently legitimized and strengthened the delusion. And this is why the cure at the mountain shrine seemed to work. It wasn't a miracle. It was a powerful counter-suggestion. By providing an equally powerful religious ritual for healing, the authorities gave the dancers' minds a pathway out of the trance, a script for recovery. They were cured by the power of suggestion, just as they had been afflicted by it. So after examining all the evidence, we can finally close the case file. The true nature of the affliction becomes clear. The cursed chamber was not a physical place. It was the human mind itself pushed beyond the limits of its endurance. The curse that fell upon Strasbourg was not demonic or divine, nor was it hidden in their daily bread. The curse was a cocktail of poverty, fear, and desperation, so potent that it shattered the sanity of an entire community. The people of Strasbourg weren't possessed by a demon from hell. They were possessed by the trauma of their own lives. And so the door to the chamber swings shut. The evidence has been presented, the theories weighed, and the ghosts of 16th century Strasbourg have been, if not laid to rest, then at least understood. We can now step back and deliver our final verdict on the bizarre and tragic case of the dancing plague of 1518. The verdict is not one of supernatural malice or criminal conspiracy, but of profound human fragility. The people of Strasbourg were not poisoned by a fungus, nor were they members of some ecstatic cult. They were not cursed by an angry saint or possessed by a legion of demons. The truth is something both simpler and infinitely more complex. They were the victims of a catastrophic psychological breakdown, a social contagion of despair that erupted from the unbearable pressures of their world. It was a fever of the mind, not the body. It was an epidemic of trauma, and the dance was its only symptom. With the verdict delivered, we are left with the final question. What was the echo of this event? What were the long-term consequences of this month of madness? You might expect a tragedy of this scale to reshape a society, to topple a government, or to inspire a new theological movement. But the dancing plague is strange in its lack of a direct, tangible legacy on the world stage. It did not spark a revolution. It did not alter the borders of the Holy Roman Empire. In the grand narrative of history, the screams of the dying dancers of Strasbourg faded remarkably quickly. It was a bizarre footnote, a historical anomaly that the world for the most part tried its best to forget. Its most immediate ripple effect was naturally felt within the city itself. In the months that followed, an exhausted silence replaced the manic music. The city had to count its dead, tend to its traumatized survivors, and attempt to stitch its social fabric back together. How do you go back to being ordinary neighbors after you have witnessed each other dance to the brink of death? The event left behind a scar of memory, a local legend that served as a grim warning for generations. But the true echo of the 1518 plague is not found in its uniqueness, but in the fact that it wasn't entirely unique at all. While Strasbourg was the most extreme and best documented case, it was part of a disturbing pattern of similar dancing manias that erupted across Europe throughout the late Middle Ages, particularly along the Rhine River in Germany and the Low Countries. These were smaller, less lethal outbreaks, but they followed the same terrifying script. People, often in large groups, would begin to dance uncontrollably, driven by an unseen force. This pattern is perhaps the strongest evidence for the psychological diagnosis. It shows that the people of Strasbourg were not an isolated case of madness, but rather the victims of a specific cultural and psychological vulnerability common to societies living under extreme and prolonged distress. Strasbourg wasn't a freak accident. It was merely the greatest hit of a whole genre of medieval misery. The event's most lasting legacy then was not felt in the courts of kings, but in the lecture halls of universities and the textbooks of doctors centuries later. The dancing plague of 1518 has become a crucial case study in the fields of psychology, sociology, and anthropology. It is one of the most vivid and horrifying examples in recorded history of mass psychogenic illness. It serves as a stark illustration of the powerful, mysterious, and sometimes terrifying link between the mind and the body, and how collective trauma can manifest in physical and even lethal ways. It forced us to acknowledge that a crowd can share a delusion just as easily as it can share a song, and that the results can be infinitely more devastating. And so, what is the final human insight we can draw from this chamber of horrors? What does this bizarre 500-year-old story really tell us about ourselves? First, it is a chilling and humbling reminder of just how thin the veneer of civilization and rationality truly is. We build our societies on foundations of logic, reason, and self-control. We believe we are masters of our own minds, captains of our own souls. But the story of Strasbourg shows that this mastery is conditional. It reveals that the human mind, when subjected to the right combination of hunger, grief, and existential dread, can snap. It can revert to something primal, something terrifying, something that makes us dance to a rhythm we don't understand for reasons we cannot name. It proves that the most secure fortress we inhabit, our own consciousness, can be overthrown from within by the ghosts of our own fears. Second, it is a timeless and profound lesson in the danger of certainty, particularly the certainty of those in power. The authorities in Strasbourg, faced with a crisis they could not comprehend, did not react with humility or caution. They reacted with absolute conviction. First, they were certain it was a medical problem requiring a physical solution, a cure that only amplified the disaster. Then, with equal certainty, they declared it a spiritual problem requiring a spiritual solution. In both cases, they applied a simple answer to an infinitely complex problem, and in doing so, they failed their people utterly. They tried to solve a problem of the soul with a prescription for the body, and later with a prayer for the heavens. They never considered that the affliction might be a direct result of the very world they governed. It's a powerful warning that when we confront the things we do not understand, our most confident solutions can often become the most effective poisons. But finally, and perhaps most importantly, the story of the dancing plague compels us to remember the victims not as a historical curiosity, but as human beings. It's easy to focus on the bizarreness of the event, to see it as a kind of historical freak show. But in doing so, we risk forgetting the individuals at its heart. The men, women, and children who were caught in its grip were not characters in a spooky story. They were people who had suffered unimaginable hardship, whose minds found a desperate, fatal exit from a life that had become unlivable. Their dance was not an act of madness, but the last tragic expression of a pain that had no other language. It proves that the most terrifying chambers are not the ones built of stone and mortar, but the ones we carry within our own skulls, where the specters of our deepest fears can at any given moment begin to dance. What do you think? Was it a disease, a delusion, or something else entirely? Let us know in the comments. And if you want to unlock more of history's cursed chambers, be sure to subscribe. The past is waiting.